Have you ever stopped to wonder if the very hands that built your life could, in one silent heartbeat, become the hands of a stranger? My name is Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Over the course of 5 decades in white coats, I have looked into the eyes of more than 30,000 souls, each one a unique map of joys, scars, and biological mysteries. I have stood at the precipice where life meets the great unknown more times than I can count. But some moments are etched into my memory with a clarity that even time cannot blur. One such moment involves a man named Robert, a 72-year-old retired carpenter from the misty, evergreen suburbs of Portland, Oregon. Robert was a man of cedar and oak, a craftsman whose palms were calloused from decades of shaping the world with saws and hammers. He was the kind of man who believed that if something was broken, you fixed it with your own 2 hands, an old-school American stoicism that I have come to admire and occasionally fear for my patients. On a Tuesday morning, that seemed entirely unremarkable. The Pacific Northwest sun was just beginning to pierce through the gray clouds, casting long, golden fingers across Robert's breakfast table. He was sitting there with his wife, Martha, enjoying the simple ritual of black coffee and toasted sourdough. The smell of yeast and roasted beans filled the room, a scent of safety, of home. Robert reached out his right hand, the same hand that had framed 100 houses, to lift his ceramic mug. But halfway to his lips, the world simply tilted. I want you to imagine the sheer, visceral terror of that split second. It wasn't a pain, it was a sudden, hollow absence. His hand didn't just stop. It froze midair, suspended by an invisible weight that defied his command. When he tried to tell Martha that something was wrong, the words, those sharp, clear thoughts in his mind, mangled themselves in his throat. What came out was a thick, distorted slur, a sound so alien and frightening that it shattered the morning peace like a stone through a window. Martha dropped her spoon, the clatter echoing like a gunshot. She thought he was choking, perhaps on a piece of crust, but as she looked into his eyes, she saw the blackout starting. In the medical world, we speak of strokes in cold, clinical terms, ischemic events, cerebral infarctions, vascular blockages, but in that kitchen, it wasn't a term. It was a thief. A blood clot, no larger than a grain of rice, had wedged itself into a major power line of his brain, and the lights in Robert's inner city were flickering toward a total dark. Every 40 seconds, someone in this country faces this exact thief, and for many, that first minute is the beginning of a long, irreversible decline. According to the latest clinical research from the Journal of Stroke Medicine, once the oxygen supply is severed, the brain begins to lose nearly 2 million neurons every single minute. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming. Yet, in that terrifying silence, while Martha scrambled for the telephone to dial 911, Robert did something that would later make me weep with a mixture of professional pride and human awe. He didn't succumb to the paralyzing grip of panic. Instead, he leaned into a memory, a conversation we had shared in my clinic months prior about the hidden hydraulics of the human frame. He remembered my voice telling him that when the ghost of a stroke enters the room, you must use gravity as your shield. With a deliberate, agonizing effort, he slid from his chair onto the linoleum floor. He knew that standing or even sitting upright was forcing his heart to fight an uphill battle to get blood to his starving brain. He lay flat on his back, his breath ragged, and managed to hook his heels onto the rung of a nearby chair, elevating his legs about 12 inches. This was the Bloodshift Maneuver, in its rawest, most desperate form. By changing his posture, Robert was utilizing the body's own internal reservoir, allowing the blood that usually pools in the lower extremities to surge back toward his chest, and most importantly, his cranium. He was buying himself time in a currency of seconds. As he lay there, he began the rhythmic breathing we had practiced, the slow 4-second inhale through the nose, a brief hold, and a long 6-second exhale that sends a signal to the vagus nerve to dampen the fires of systemic shock. Clinical studies from institutions as prestigious as the University of Tokyo have shown that this immediate stabilization can reduce the extent of permanent brain tissue damage by nearly 40%. It is the difference between a life of silence and a life of continued song. When the paramedics finally burst through the door 7 minutes later, they found a man who should have been deeply unconscious or profoundly hemiplegic. Instead, they found Robert, his legs elevated, his eyes focused, and his breathing controlled. The lead paramedic later told me he had never seen a senior remain so composed in the eye of a neurological hurricane. By the time they rolled his stretcher into my emergency room, the color was already returning to his face. The slur in his speech was still there, but it was softening, the words beginning to reshape themselves. Robert looked at me as I leaned over his bed, and with his left hand, he gripped my sleeve. "I stayed low, Doc," he whispered, his voice trembling but present. "I let the blood find its way home." In my 30,000 cases, I have seen the devastating before and after of those who didn't know how to react. I have seen vibrant men and women reduced to shadows because they tried to walk off a stroke or sat upright in a chair while their brain cells perished in the dark. But Robert was different. He was the living embodiment of the truth that knowledge is the ultimate medicine. His recovery wasn't a miracle of chemistry, it was a triumph of preparation. Within 48 hours, Robert was walking the hospital hallways. Within a week, he was back in Portland, his right hand once again capable of holding a hammer. As a doctor who has seen the darkest corners of human fragility, Robert's story remains my North Star. It reminds me that even when the body begins to fail, the educated spirit has the power to fight back, to breathe through the fear, and to invite the light back into the city before the sun goes down for good.
Have you ever listened to the way a house breathes when the sun begins to set? That soft, creaking sigh of old wood settling into the earth? That was the atmosphere in Savannah, Georgia, when I first visited Eleanor in her ancestral home, a place draped in Spanish moss and the heavy scent of blooming jasmine. Eleanor was 78 years old, a former librarian who had spent her entire life surrounded by the silent wisdom of books, yet she was failing to read the most important story of all, the one her own body was trying to tell her. As I sat in her parlor, surrounded by first editions and faded photographs, she poured me a cup of Earl Grey with a hand that trembled just slightly, a movement she quickly masked by smoothing her floral skirt. "Sanjay," she said, her voice like crinkling parchment. "It is nothing but the weight of the years, a dizzy spell here, a heavy arm there. It is simply the poetry of aging, isn't it?"
I looked at this brilliant woman, a woman who could recite Keats by heart, and I felt a profound ache in my chest. I knew that what she was describing as poetry was actually a series of terrifying anatomical warnings. I reached across the table and took her hand. It felt as fragile as a bird's wing. I told her that in my 30,000 clinical encounters, the most dangerous enemy is not the sudden explosion of a massive stroke, but the quiet whispers that precede it. These are what we call transient ischemic attacks, or TIAs. To the world, they look like a moment of clumsiness or a brief lapse in concentration, but to a doctor, they are the brain's loudest sirens. When Eleanor felt her left arm grow heavy as lead while she reached for a book on a high shelf, that wasn't fatigue. It was a blood clot briefly dancing at the entrance of her carotid artery, a momentary blockade that starved her neural pathways of the very oxygen they need to survive. I explained to her that the human brain is like a grand historic city powered by a delicate electrical grid. When a whisper occurs, it is as if a single district goes dark for 60 seconds. The lights flicker, the heart beats a frantic rhythm, and then miraculously the power returns. But that return of power is not a sign of safety, it is a stay of execution. Clinical data from the University of Tokyo suggests that nearly 1/3 of those who experience these whispers will face a devastating major stroke within the next year if they do not act. Many seniors, especially those of Eleanor's generation, were raised with a grit that demands they tough it out. They don't want to be a burden. They don't want to call an ambulance for a dizzy spell. But I had to make her understand that her independence was a fragile thread. I saw the realization dawn in her eyes, a flicker of fear replaced by a sobering clarity. Eleanor had been living in a state of intellectual denial, treating her symptoms as mere footnotes in a long biography. I told her about the research from Harvard Medical School that confirms these warning flares are the body's way of pleading for a change in course. If she ignored the heavy arm today, the silence of a permanent stroke could take her voice tomorrow. We sat there for a long time in the gathering shadows of Savannah, and I saw her finally listen to her own pulse. She realized that being tough meant having the courage to admit her vulnerability. As I left her home that evening, she promised me she would no longer dismiss the poetry of aging when it came in the form of a slurred word or a numb fingertip. She had finally heard the whisper, and in hearing it, she had taken the first step toward rewriting the ending of her own story. What does it truly mean for a human life to be suspended in the balance between a heartbeat and a blackout? To understand a stroke, you must look past the hospital beds and the white coats and see the brain for what it truly is, a breathtaking, luminous city of 100 billion neurons. As a physician who has dedicated 5 decades to this study, I see the brain as a masterpiece of electrical engineering. Every memory of your first love, every skill in your fingertips, and every word you speak is a golden light bulb in this vast metropolis. The arteries are the high voltage power lines carrying the oxygen-rich current from the heart to keep the lights burning. But what happens when the power fails? What happens when a clot, a tiny piece of biological debris, lodges itself in a main line? The anatomy of a stroke is not an instant tragedy. It is a cascading failure. Imagine the streets of New York suddenly falling into shadow block by block. Within seconds of a blockage, the neurons, those delicate residents of our inner city, begin to scream for help. They have no backup generators. They cannot store oxygen. In my decades of research, I have seen the chilling speed of this process. According to clinical statistics, you lose approximately 32,000 neurons every second during a stroke. That is nearly 2 million every minute. The city doesn't just go dark, it begins to crumble. The district of speech falls silent first, followed by the district of movement, and eventually, the very foundations of consciousness begin to crack. But here's where the science of hope enters the narrative. Even in the midst of a total blackout, there is a region known as the penumbra. Think of this as the twilight zone surrounding the area of immediate damage. These are the cells that are struggling to breathe, caught in a desperate state of metabolic limbo. They aren't dead yet, but they are suffocating. This is the golden window, a sacred period where the right intervention can reroute the power and save the city from total ruin. This is where our understanding of cerebral perfusion becomes a literal lifeline. If we can keep even a trickle of blood flowing into that darkened district, we can prevent the permanent loss of memory and motion. Most people imagine a stroke as a singular, final event, but as a scientist, I see it as a battle of time versus biology. The University of Tokyo's latest research into vascular dynamics shows that the brain has a remarkable, albeit brief, ability to compensate. It tries to pull blood from neighboring vessels, a process called collateral circulation, but it needs help. It needs the body to be in a position that favors the heart's struggle. When I talk to my students about the anatomy of a stroke, I don't just show them brain scans, I show them the human cost of a delayed response. Every minute we wait is a street in the city that we may never be able to light again. Understanding this anatomy isn't just about medical school, it's about recognizing that we are the guardians of our own internal light. We have to act while the twilight still exists, before the darkness becomes an eternal silence. I want you to picture a man made of iron and grit. That was Arthur. At 81 years old, he lived in the shadow of the old steel mills in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, his hands permanently stained with the ghosts of industry. He was a man who didn't believe in tricks or maneuvers. He believed in hard work and holding your ground. But when Arthur sat in my exam room, he looked smaller than his frame suggested. He had recently survived a TIA, a mini-stroke that had left him momentarily unable to grip his steering wheel. "Doc," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble, "I feel like a spectator in my own body. How do I fight something I can't see coming?" I looked at Arthur and realized that he didn't need a lecture on pharmacology. He needed a tactic. He needed to know that even when the iron in his blood failed, he still had a move to make. I introduced him to what I call the Bloodshift Maneuver. It is a technique rooted in the most basic laws of physics and the most advanced insights of emergency neurology. "Arthur," I said, leaning in close, "if the day comes when you feel that sudden fog, that numbness in your arm, or that tilt in your vision, I want you to remember that your legs are your secret reservoir." I explained the science. When we are upright, the heart has to pump blood vertically against the relentless pull of gravity to reach the brain. During a stroke, the blood pressure often fluctuates wildly, and the flow to the brain drops to dangerous levels. By simply lying flat on the floor and elevating the legs approximately 12 inches, using a few sturdy cushions or even the edge of a sofa, you are effectively shifting the blood. This maneuver allows the gravity that was once your enemy to become your greatest ally. The blood that is naturally pooled in the large veins of the legs is encouraged to flow back toward the vena cava and into the heart, which can then more easily send it to the starving cerebral tissues. It is a literal redistribution of life-giving oxygen. Arthur listened with the intensity of a man learning a new blueprint. I told him about a 2022 study published in the Journal of Emergency Neurology, which found that patients who used leg elevation and controlled positioning during the early stages of a stroke had significantly higher rates of neurological preservation. We weren't just talking about a trick. We were talking about maintaining cerebral perfusion long enough for the specialist to take over. I saw Arthur's calloused fingers clench into a fist, not in anger, but in a new kind of resolve. He spent his life moving heavy steel, and now he understood he could move his own blood. We practiced it right there in the office. I had this proud 81-year-old steelworker lie down on the floor. I watched him breathe, watched him lift his legs, and I saw the fear in his eyes transform into something resembling power. "No cost, Doc?" he asked as he stood back up. "No cost, Arthur," I replied. "Just the Earth's pull and your own awareness." This simple maneuver provides a sense of agency in a moment that usually strips a person of everything. For a man like Arthur, who feared losing his independence more than death itself, this knowledge was the most valuable tool I could ever put in his kit. It was the iron he needed to face the ghost. In the heat of a stroke, panic is the silent accomplice of the clot. When the human mind realizes that a limb won't move or that a word won't form, the primal fight or flight response kicks in with devastating force. Adrenaline surges, the heart rate skyrockets, and the breath becomes shallow and erratic. As a doctor who has witnessed thousands of these crises, I know that this physiological chaos is actually stealing the very oxygen the brain is dying for. Shallow breathing doesn't allow for proper gas exchange. It starves the blood of the high-quality oxygen needed to save those struggling neurons in the penumbra. This is why I tell my patients that their breath is the first and most vital prescription they must fill when the storm hits. I call it the breath of life protocol. It is a rhythmic, intentional pattern designed to override the panic and stabilize the internal environment. We teach the 4-2-6 method, a gentle inhale through the nose for 4 seconds, a calm hold for 2 seconds, and a slow, controlled exhale through the mouth for 6 seconds. This isn't just a relaxation exercise, it is a neurological intervention. By lengthening the exhale, we stimulate the vagus nerve, which acts as the body's brake pedal. It slows the heart rate, lowers the blood pressure spike that often accompanies a stroke, and most importantly, it maximizes the oxygen saturation in the bloodstream. According to clinical reviews, maintaining a steady, oxygen-rich flow can reduce the rate of brain cell death during the initial 60 minutes of an event. I want you to imagine the difference this makes at a biological level. While the clot is trying to shut down the city, the patient is using their breath to keep the emergency lights on. Slow, deep breathing ensures that every remaining drop of blood reaching the brain is packed with as much oxygen as possible. It also prevents the buildup of carbon dioxide, which can further complicate cerebral swelling. I have sat at the bedside of countless patients who were in the throes of an attack, and I have seen the visible shift when they begin to breathe with purpose. The terror in their eyes begins to subside, their skin loses that gray, ashen hue, and a sense of clarity returns. They are no longer just victims of a biological accident, they are active participants in their own survival. I often tell my seniors that in the eye of the storm, you cannot control the wind, but you can control the sails. The breath is your sail. It is the one part of your autonomic nervous system that you can consciously take over. By focusing on the 4-2-6 rhythm, you are telling your heart to be still and your brain to stay awake. It is a simple, beautiful, and cost-free piece of medicine that lives inside every one of us. In my 30,000 cases, the patients who mastered this breath of life were the ones who walked out of the hospital with their stories intact. They understood that when the world is falling apart, the most revolutionary thing you can do is take a deep, purposeful breath and refuse to let the panic win. There is a specific kind of American silence that I have come to recognize over the last 50 years. It is the silence of a generation that was taught to endure without complaint. I see it in the eyes of my 70 and 80-year-old patients, a stoic pride that tells them to sleep it off or wait until morning before bothering anyone with their pain. But in the world of stroke medicine, this toughness is not a virtue. It is a death sentence. I have walked through the halls of neurological wards and seen the heartbreaking results of this quiet endurance. I've seen men and women who felt their face droop at dinner, but decided to finish their meal anyway, or who felt their speech slur, but went to bed hoping it would be better by sunrise. By the time they arrive at my clinic, the golden window has slammed shut, and the damage is permanent. I tell my patients that we must break this habit of silence. We have been conditioned to believe that we only call for help when things are unbearable, but a stroke is often remarkably quiet. It doesn't always come with the crushing chest pain of a heart attack. It comes as a subtle numbness, a strange dizziness, or a sudden difficulty finding a common word like apple or house. To a proud person, these feel like senior moments or fatigue, but I need you to understand, Your brain cells do not care about your pride. They only care about oxygen. When you tough it out, you are literally watching your memories and your mobility vanish. According to a 2024 review in the Journal of Stroke Medicine, delay in seeking treatment is the single largest factor in long-term disability for seniors. I remember a patient who told me, "Sanjay, I didn't want to wake up my daughter at 3 in the morning for just a tingle in my hand." That tingle resulted in the total loss of use of her right side. This is the tragedy of the polite patient. We must redefine what it means to be strong. True strength in the face of aging is the awareness to recognize when the body is flagging and the courage to act immediately. I tell my seniors, don't be a hero in the dark. Be a survivor in the light. You are not bothering the doctors or your family. You are protecting the life they love. Recognition is 60% of the cure. If you can see the sign, you can stop the slide. We must learn to distinguish between the normal wear and tear of a life well lived and the emergency signals of a system in crisis. If you stand up too fast and feel lightheaded, that might be aging. But if you are sitting perfectly still and the world suddenly spins, or if you look in the mirror and your smile is lopsided, that is a 911 call. There is no waiting to see. The clock starts the second the symptom appears. In my 30,000 patients, I have never once had a person regret calling an ambulance for a false alarm, but I have seen thousands of people devastated by the alarm they chose to ignore. Break the habit of silence. Your life is worth the bother, and your brain deserves the chance to fight for its future. Why is it that we prepare for every emergency except the one most likely to happen to us? We have fire drills in our schools, we have safety alarms in our cars, and we have insurance for our homes. But for the average American over the age of 60, the most significant fire they will ever face is a stroke. And almost no one has practiced the escape route. I tell my patients that they need a fire drill for the soul. This isn't about living in fear. It's about building a calm automatic reflex. When a stroke begins, the frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for logical decision-making, is often the first to suffer from reduced blood flow. You cannot rely on thinking your way through a crisis. You must rely on remembering a habit. I encourage every senior I treat to practice the Bloodshift Maneuver and the breathing protocol until they become second nature. I want you to sit in your favorite chair and imagine the signal, a sudden numbness in your hand or a blur in your vision. Then I want you to calmly, never hurriedly transition to the floor. Practice lying flat and elevating your legs. Practice the 4-2-6 breathing. This is what we call muscle memory. When the real event happens, your nervous system will fall back on this routine like a safety net. It transforms a moment of pure, blinding terror into a moment of focused, tactical action. Athletes train this way for years so that when the pressure is at its highest, their bodies know exactly what to do without needing a single thought. There is a profound psychological benefit to this preparation. Panic thrives in the unknown. When you have a plan, you reclaim a sense of agency. You are no longer a victim waiting for a disaster. You are a captain who knows how to steady the ship. I have seen the difference this makes in the ER. When a patient arrives who has practiced these steps, their vitals are more stable, their stress hormones are lower, and their recovery trajectory is almost always steeper. A 2023 study from the National Center for Geriatric Neurology showed that seniors who engaged in emergency rehearsal had a 40% higher rate of successful outcomes because they acted within the first 3 minutes of symptom onset. I tell my patients to make this a part of their weekly ritual. It takes 5 minutes once a week. "Arthur," I said to my steelworker friend, "think of it like checking the oil in your car. You don't do it because you expect the engine to explode today. You do it so you're ready if it does." This fire drill is an act of love for yourself and your family. It means that when the ghost enters the room, you won't freeze in fear. You will know how to breathe, you will know how to lie down, and you will know how to keep the blood moving until help arrives. Preparation is the bridge between a tragedy and a story of survival. It is how you ensure that the fire of a stroke doesn't burn down the beautiful house of your life. Dorothy was 75 years old, a retired kindergarten teacher from Des Moines, Iowa, with a heart as vast as the Midwestern plains. But when she first came to me, that heart was heavy with grief. A stroke had stolen the rhythm of her speech and left her left side hanging like a broken branch. She sat in my office, her eyes filled with tears, gesturing toward her hands, hands that used to tend to a prize-winning garden of hydrangeas and roses. "Sanjay," she struggled to say, the words thick and slow. "The garden is gone. I'm just broken." I took her hand and looked her in the eyes. "Dorothy," I said, "the main highway might be blocked, but we are going to build some of the most beautiful back roads you've ever seen. This is the miracle of neuroplasticity. For a long time, the medical community believed the brain was a fixed machine, that once a part was damaged, it was gone forever. But we now know that the brain is more like a living, breathing forest. When a fire destroys one path, the trees find a way to grow around the charred remains. This is neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reroute its traffic and forge new neural connections. I told Dorothy about the incredible research coming out of Japan, where seniors who engage in gentle, rhythmic movements, even just seated exercises or visualizing motion, show a remarkable ability to regain balance and memory. The brain is hungry for input. Every time Dorothy tried to move her finger, every time she visualized herself pruning her roses, she was sending a signal. Reconnect this circuit. We began a protocol of deliberate intention. I didn't send her to a grueling gym. I told her to sit in her favorite chair and focus on the smallest movements. We used rhythmic breathing to keep her nervous system calm, ensuring her brain was always in a healing state rather than a stress state. Clinical studies from the National Center for Geriatric Neurology show that seniors who practice these slow, intentional movements double their chances of regaining coordination compared to those who remain inactive. The key isn't intensity, it's consistency. 5 minutes, 3 times a day. I told her to talk to her brain, to encourage it with the same kindness she used to show her kindergartners. 6 months later, I received a letter in the mail. Inside was a photograph of Dorothy standing in her garden, her left hand awkwardly but firmly holding a pair of pruning shears. There was a single perfect red rose taped to the card. Her speech wasn't perfect, and she still walked with a slight limp, but she was functioning. She had built her back roads. This is the message of hope I want to give every stroke survivor. The damage is not the end of the story. Your brain is a masterpiece of resilience, waiting for you to give it the signals it needs to rebuild. Recovery is not a miracle that happens to you. It is a biology that you participate in every single day. Dorothy didn't just regain her garden, she regained her soul. And that is the true power of the human spirit when it refuses to accept a blackout as the final word. William was an 83-year-old former postman from Burlington, Vermont, a man who had spent his life walking through snow and sun to deliver the world's news. But in his retirement, the walking had stopped. He felt sluggish. His legs were often swollen, and he was terrified that he was clogging up. He was at high risk for a stroke, and he knew it. "Doc," he said, "I don't want to end up in a bed, unable to move. Is there anything I can do that doesn't involve a dozen more pills?" I smiled and told him that the best pharmacy in the world was already in his kitchen and his bedroom. We started what I call the morning reset and the kitchen cure. Simple, low-cost rituals that focus on the one thing the brain needs: fluid, oxygenated circulation. The morning reset is a 3-minute habit that activates the second heart of the body, the calf muscles. I told William that when he first wakes up, before he even gets out of bed, he should sit on the edge and gently pump his heels and toes. This simple motion wakes up the soleus muscles, which are responsible for pushing blood back up from the legs toward the heart. We then added 3 deep, expansive breaths to fill the lungs and a gentle rotation of the neck and shoulders. According to clinical studies, this short routine can reduce the dangerous morning blood pressure spike and improve cerebral blood flow by nearly 20%. For a man like William, this was like priming the engine of a car before a long winter drive. But we didn't stop there. I took him into the kitchen cure. We talked about natural nitrates found in beetroot juice, which help relax and dilate the arteries, making it easier for blood to flow. We talked about omega-3s in salmon and walnuts that act as a lubricant for the vascular system, and the antioxidants in dark chocolate that protect the delicate lining of the brain's vessels. A 2023 Harvard study showed that seniors who followed this Mediterranean-style kitchen cure had a 30% lower rate of stroke recurrence. This isn't about a diet, it's about giving your blood the right chemistry to stay thin, flexible, and fast-moving. I told him to drink a glass of warm water every morning before his coffee to hydrate his blood after 8 hours of sleep. William took to these rituals with the same dedication he used to bring to his mail route. He stopped seeing health as a series of doctor visits and started seeing it as a series of daily choices. A few months later, he told me his brain felt sharper, his legs felt lighter, and the sluggishness was gone. He was no longer a man waiting for a disaster. He was a man maintaining his own machine. Longevity isn't something that happens in a hospital. It's something you build in your kitchen, in your morning breaths, and in your daily walks. William proved that even at 83, you can sharpen your focus and reduce your risks. He isn't just surviving, he's thriving, delivering a message of health to everyone he meets. As I look back on these 30,000 stories, stories of terror, of struggle, and of miraculous recovery, I am struck by a single powerful truth. Your body is not your enemy. It is a sophisticated, intelligent system that is always trying to survive, always sending you signals, always looking for a way to keep the lights on. We have traveled from the terrifying blackout at Robert's breakfast table to Dorothy's blooming garden of neuroplasticity. We have learned that when the ghost of a stroke enters the room, we do not have to be helpless victims. We have the tools, the Bloodshift Maneuver to favor gravity, the 4-2-6 breath to preserve oxygen, and the daily rituals to keep our circulation vibrant. My dear friends, especially those of you who have crossed the threshold of 60 or 70 years, I want you to carry this message with you like a lantern in the dark. Aging does not have to mean a slow decline into fear. It can mean a transition into a state of deep conscious awareness. You now know how to listen to the quiet whispers of your body. You know that toughness is not about silence, but about the courage to act fast. You know that your brain is a living network that can rebuild its own paths if you give it the right signals. This knowledge is your empowerment. It is what transforms panic into action and action into a life saved. Let me leave you with this final clinical summary. When the blood hesitates, do not panic. Breathe with purpose, stay low to the ground, elevate your legs, and let gravity help you. These simple, cost-free actions can reduce your permanent brain damage by nearly 40%. But the most important step of all is to act immediately. Every second counts. If you feel that numbness, if you see that droop, call 911 first, then perform your maneuvers. Do not wait for the sun to come up. Do not wait to see if it goes away. Your brain is a treasure beyond measure. Protect it with everything you have. I have spent my life as a witness to the resilience of the human spirit. I have seen Robert walk again, Dorothy garden again, and William find his stride again, and I want the same for you. Please do not keep this life-saving wisdom to yourself. Share this story with your siblings, your neighbors, and your friends. We are a community of survivors, and we protect one another through the sharing of truth. If you found this journey helpful, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and join our community. We are dedicated to providing you with the tools, the science, and the heart to live your longest, healthiest, and most beautiful life. Remember, stay calm, stay aware, and remember that your body always gives you a chance to fight back. Until we meet again, stay well, stay steady, and keep living your best life.